Hi, I'm Sarah. And if you've ever had someone you trusted completely destroy your future while convincing everyone you're the problem, then maybe you'll understand this. My best friend didn't just steal my $1 million business idea. She used 2 years of recorded conversations, hacked into my personal files, and manipulated every investor contact I had while telling them I was an unstable dreamer who never followed through. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering she'd been planning this systematic destruction of my career since the day I first shared my vision with her. While I was working 16-hour days coding in my cramped apartment, she was building a network of lies so sophisticated that when she finally struck, everyone believed her version of events. But when her own developer accidentally exposed the truth, I didn't scream. I didn't post angry rants on social media. I let the evidence do what emotions never could. And now, let's just say she won't be giving any more talks about authentic entrepreneurship. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning when the Seattle rain was doing that thing it does. Not quite drizzling, not quite pouring. Just existing in that persistent way that makes you question whether you remembered to close your windows. I wasn't expecting anything, but there it sat on my doorstep, like an unwelcome memory wrapped in brown paper and sealed with the kind of tape that screams, "I don't care if this survives the journey." Inside, nestled between crumpled newspaper, was my old coffee mug. The navy blue one with "World's Best Co-Founder" printed in fading gold letters. A joke gift Jess had given me 2 years ago, when we'd spent an entire weekend dreaming about building something revolutionary together. No note, no return address, just that mug sitting there like a silent accusation. I held it in both hands, feeling the familiar chip on the handle where I'd dropped it that frantic morning when the first investor rejection email arrived. Back then, Jess had been sitting across from me at my kitchen table, laptop open, reassuring me that rejection was just redirection. "Sarah," she'd said, her eyes bright with what I thought was genuine excitement. "This idea is going to change everything. Mental health support that actually learns and adapts, that actually understands users instead of just throwing generic meditation tracks at them. This is bigger than both of us." I used to think betrayal announced itself with dramatic confrontations and slammed doors. I thought it came with obvious villains who twirled metaphorical mustaches and cackled while they schemed. But mine arrived dressed as support, wrapped in enthusiasm, and delivered with the kind of smile that made you feel grateful someone believed in your crazy dreams. Standing in my apartment hallway, staring at that mug, I almost laughed at the cruel poetry of it all. How perfectly fitting that an object meant to celebrate partnership had circled back to mark its death. The mug represented everything I'd lost and everything I'd been too naive to protect. It was a monument to misplaced trust and a reminder that sometimes the people closest to your dreams are the ones most capable of stealing them. The story really began 18 months earlier, in the cramped WeWork space where I'd been camping, out between my day job and my real passion. I was a data analyst by necessity and an app developer by obsession, spending my lunch breaks sketching user interface designs on napkins and my evenings learning Swift programming from YouTube tutorials. The idea for MindBridge had been consuming me for months, an AI-powered mental health app that could actually understand context, that could recognize when someone was having a panic attack versus a bad day, that could provide personalized support instead of one-size-fits-all solutions. Jess found me there one evening around 9, hunched over my laptop with empty coffee cups forming a protective barrier around my workspace. She worked in marketing for a tech startup 3 floors up, and we'd bonded over late-night elevator rides and shared complaints about the broken coffee machine in the lobby. She was everything I wasn't: confident in meetings, comfortable with networking, able to walk into a room and immediately identify who mattered and why. "Still working on the world-changing app?" she'd asked, sliding into the chair across from Me with her own laptop bag and a genuine smile that made my imposter syndrome feel less crushing. I'd shown her the mock-ups I'd been working on, explained the machine learning algorithms I was trying to implement, walked her through my vision of an app that could genuinely help people instead of just collecting their data. She listened with the kind of focused attention that made you feel like your ideas actually mattered, asking thoughtful questions about user experience and market positioning that showed she understood both the technical and business sides of what I was trying to build. "This is incredible, Sarah," she'd said, leaning back in her chair with something that looked like awe. "You're talking about revolutionizing how people access mental health support. This could help millions of people who can't afford therapy or don't have access to quality care." That was the moment I should have been more careful. That was when I should have noticed how quickly she grasped concepts that had taken me months to develop, how easily she spoke about monetization strategies I'd barely begun to consider. But instead, I felt validated in a way I hadn't experienced since starting this project. Someone else could see the vision. Someone else understood why this mattered. Over the following weeks, our casual conversations evolved into regular brainstorming sessions. Jess would stay late at her office, then come down to wherever I was working to discuss everything from user acquisition strategies to the ethical implications of AI and mental health. She had insights about marketing psychology that complemented my technical knowledge, and for the first time, building MindBridge felt less like a lonely obsession and more like a collaborative mission. "You know what you need?" she said one evening as we walked to the parking garage together. "You need to start documenting everything: ideas, code, user research. If this takes off, and it will, you'll want to have a clear paper trail of how it all developed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." It seemed like practical advice from someone who understood the business world better than I did. So I started keeping detailed notes, recording voice memos when inspiration struck, even filming short videos where I walked through my latest breakthroughs. I thought I was building a portfolio of my creative process. I didn't realize I was creating evidence for someone else to claim. The first red flag should have been how quickly Jess absorbed technical concepts that should have been outside her expertise. When I explained the neural network architecture I was designing, she didn't just nod politely. She asked follow-up questions about training data and model validation that suggested she'd been researching machine learning on her own time. When I mentioned struggling with user authentication protocols, she somehow knew exactly which frameworks I should investigate. "I've been reading about this stuff," she'd explain when I expressed surprise at her knowledge. "Your project has gotten me really interested in the intersection of technology and mental health. I've been taking some online courses." I found it flattering rather than suspicious. Here was someone so inspired by my work that she was educating herself to better support my vision. I saw dedication where I should have seen preparation. The second red flag was subtler, but should have been more alarming. Every time I shared a breakthrough or solved a particularly challenging problem, Jess would ask me to explain it again, often requesting that I walk through my thought process step by step. "I want to make sure I really understand," she'd say. "This is so fascinating, and I want to be able to explain it properly when we start pitching to investors." We. The word felt natural at the time, a sign that I finally had a true partner in this venture. But looking back, I can see how carefully she inserted herself into my narrative, how skillfully she positioned herself as an integral part of something she'd had no role in creating. The third red flag was her sudden networking surge. Jess had always been socially connected, but around the same time our collaborations intensified, she started attending every tech meetup, startup event, and entrepreneurship workshop in the city. She'd send me photos from these events, her smiling with venture capitalists, standing next to successful founders, holding business cards from people I'd been trying to connect with for months. "Building our network," she'd text with these photos. Everyone's going to want to meet the brilliant mind behind MindBridge. Again, I felt supported rather than threatened. She was doing the relationship building that terrified me, opening doors I didn't have the confidence to approach myself. I saw her networking as an extension of our partnership, not as reconnaissance for a hostile takeover. The fourth red flag was the most obvious in retrospect, but at the time it felt like validation. Jess started scheduling coffee meetings with people in the mental health tech space, always inviting me, but somehow ending up in most of these conversations alone when I couldn't make it due to work conflicts. She'd report back with detailed summaries of what potential collaborators and advisors had said, what feedback they'd given about the app concept, what suggestions they'd made for improvement. Dr. Martinez thinks your approach to anxiety detection is groundbreaking, she'd tell me after meeting with a clinical psychologist who consulted for tech companies. She said the market is desperate for something this sophisticated. The team at Wellness Ventures wants to hear more about our user acquisition strategy, she'd report after a meeting I'd missed due to a deadline at my day job. They're really excited about the potential. Our user acquisition strategy, our approach. The language of shared ownership was so gradual, so seemingly natural, that I didn't notice how completely she'd embedded herself in my project's identity. By the time I recognized what was happening, the narrative had already shifted from Sarah's app that Jess supports to Sarah and Jess's collaborative venture to eventually Jess's innovative concept with technical input from Sarah. The transformation was so skillfully executed that I found myself questioning my own memory of how MindBridge had originated. When Jess would reference our initial brainstorming sessions or talk about when we first came up with the core concept, I'd experience a moment of cognitive dissonance. Had we developed these ideas together? Was my memory of those solitary months of research and development somehow inaccurate? This psychological manipulation was perhaps her most effective tool. By gradually rewriting the history of the project, while I was living it, she made me complicit in my own erasure. I started doubting not just my ownership of specific ideas, but my competence as an entrepreneur. Maybe I did need her business acumen to make this work. Maybe my technical skills weren't enough without her marketing expertise. Maybe solo founders really were at a disadvantage in today's collaborative startup ecosystem. The doubt she planted grew like a virus, infecting my confidence and making me grateful for her involvement rather than protective of my intellectual property. When she suggested we formalize our partnership with a written agreement, I felt relieved rather than cautious. Finally, I thought, we were making this official. Finally, I had the business partner I needed to turn my vision into reality. I should have read that partnership agreement more carefully. I should have insisted on legal review. I should have questioned why someone who'd joined my project months into its development was asking for equal equity and shared decision-making authority. But by that point, she'd so thoroughly convinced me that I needed her expertise that signing away half, my ownership felt like a fair exchange for her business development skills. The meeting where I signed those papers was held at her suggestion in a trendy coffee shop downtown, surrounded by other entrepreneurs and creatives working on their own projects. The symbolism felt intentional. We were just two ambitious women, formalizing a partnership that would change both our lives. She'd brought printed copies of the agreement, professional-looking documents that outlined our respective responsibilities and shared ownership of all intellectual property related to MindBridge. "I know this feels formal," she'd said as I signed. "My name on each page. But protecting our partnership legally will let us focus on building something amazing without worrying about the business stuff. Our partnership, our intellectual property." Even as I was signing away half my rights to my own creation, she was using language that made the transaction feel collaborative rather than extractive. I left that coffee shop feeling like I'd finally taken a crucial step toward making my dreams reality. I didn't realize I'd just signed the death warrant for my role in my own company. The execution of her plan began immediately after those documents were signed, though it was so subtle I didn't recognize it as an execution at all. She started taking the lead on investor communications, explaining that her marketing background made her better suited for crafting compelling pitches. She began representing us at networking events where I couldn't attend, building relationships with potential funders and advisors who would know her name before they ever heard mine. Most insidiously, she started controlling the narrative around MindBridge's origin story. In presentations and conversations with investors, the app's development became a collaborative effort from day one, with technical and business elements evolving simultaneously through our shared vision. My months of solitary research and development were compressed into a brief technical validation phase, while the real innovation was positioned as our joint conceptual breakthrough. By the time I realized what was happening, she'd so thoroughly established herself as MindBridge's co-founder that challenging the narrative would have seemed like an irrational attempt to claim credit for collaborative work. She'd used my own documentation against me, referencing the detailed notes and recordings I'd created as evidence of our shared development process rather than my individual creative journey. The mug in my hands had become heavier as I remembered all of this, weighted with the full knowledge of how systematically I'd been manipulated and erased. But as I stood there in my apartment hallway, something was different from those early days of confusion and self-doubt. The woman holding this mug wasn't the same person who'd signed those partnership papers in naive gratitude. This woman had learned some things about truth, about evidence, and about the difference between collaboration and exploitation. I walked to my kitchen, set the mug on the counter, and opened my laptop. It was time to start documenting again, but this time I'd be recording someone else's lies rather than my own innovations. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim your story is to let someone else's contradictions expose the truth. The investigation phase of my life began not with dramatic confrontations or angry accusations, but with the methodical precision of someone who'd finally learned that emotions make noise while evidence makes change. 3 days after receiving that mug, I started what I privately called Project Truth, a systematic excavation of 18 months of carefully buried deceptions. My first stop was the digital graveyard of our shared Google Drive. Jess had removed herself from most of the folders after our partnership dissolved, but she'd overlooked the sharing history logs. Every file access, every download, every timestamp was preserved like digital DNA evidence. What I found there made my hands shake, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes when puzzle pieces finally click into place. She'd been accessing my private development folders for months before we'd ever discussed collaboration. Files I'd never shared with her, code repositories I'd kept private, even personal voice memos I'd recorded late at night when breakthrough ideas struck. All of them showed her digital fingerprints. The timestamps revealed a pattern of systematic surveillance that began just 2 weeks after our first casual conversation about MindBridge. But the most damning evidence was in the file modification histories. Documents I remembered creating alone showed editing records under her account, often at times when I was at my day job, and she should have been at hers. She hadn't just been stealing my current work, she'd been going back and retroactively, inserting herself into my creative process, literally rewriting the digital history of my project's development. I printed everything. Every access log, every timestamp, every modification record. My kitchen table became a war room of evidence, organized by date and cross-referenced with my own calendar to establish where I'd been when these unauthorized accesses occurred. This wasn't the behavior of a casual collaborator or an enthusiastic supporter. This was industrial espionage performed by someone who understood exactly what they were stealing and why it mattered. The email evidence was even more illuminating. I'd kept every message exchange between us, but I'd never read them with a detective's eye before. Now, reviewing them chronologically, I could see the sophisticated psychological manipulation embedded in seemingly supportive communications. Every time I'd shared a breakthrough or solved a difficult problem, her responses followed the same pattern: enthusiasm, detailed follow-up questions, requests for clarification, and then suggestions for Improvements that inevitably involved expanding her role in the project. Your breakthrough with the mood pattern recognition is incredible. She'd written after I'd spent 3 sleepless nights solving a machine learning challenge. Can you walk me through the algorithm design again? I want to make sure I understand it completely so I can help explain it to potential investors. Also, have you considered how we might scale this approach for different demographic groups? I've been researching market segmentation strategies that could really amplify the impact. The word "we" appeared in her emails weeks before she'd ever explicitly asked to be involved in the project. She'd been linguistically embedding herself in my work, while I was still thinking of her as an interested friend. Every suggestion came wrapped in the language of collaboration, but the underlying message was clear. Your technical skills need my business expertise. Your innovation needs my strategic thinking. Your vision needs my execution. Even more revealing was the correspondence I found between her email account and addresses I didn't recognize. Using some creative Google searching and LinkedIn investigation, I discovered she'd been reaching out to people in the mental health tech space, positioning herself as MindBridge's business development lead months before I'd agreed to any formal partnership. She'd been building a professional network around my intellectual property, while I was still struggling to perfect the underlying technology. The breakthrough moment came when I found her communication with TechCrunch writer David Chen. Yes, the same surname as the mysterious J. Chen Consulting email that had accessed my private files. A series of emails revealed that Jessica Chen wasn't just a business alias. It was a complete professional identity she'd constructed around my work. She'd been giving interviews about MindBridge's development, speaking at virtual conferences about AI and mental health, even accepting speaking fees for presenting her innovative approach to personalized mental health technology. In one email, she'd sent David what she called exclusive behind-the-scenes documentation of MindBridge's development process. The attachments were my private voice memos, my personal development logs, my confidential user research, all recontextualized as collaborative documentation that showcased the team's innovative approach. She'd taken my most personal creative moments and packaged them as marketing materials for her own professional advancement. But the most chilling discovery was a calendar appointment from 6 months earlier titled Investor Strategy Session. The location was listed as WeWork, the base, same space where I'd been working when she'd first discovered my project. The meeting attendees included her personal email, a venture capital firm I'd never heard of, and an email address belonging to Marcus Rivera, the developer I'd been paying freelance rates to help with back-end infrastructure. Marcus, the same. Marcus, who'd been asking increasingly detailed questions about my business plans, who'd suggested I needed professional marketing support, who'd recommended I formalize any partnership agreements before the project gained serious investor attention. I'd thought he was looking out for my interests as a fellow developer. Now I realized he'd been feeding information to someone who was systematically positioning herself to claim ownership of my work. I called Marcus immediately, my phone on speaker as I continued organizing evidence. "Sarah, hey," he answered, but his voice carried a tension I'd never heard before. "What's up?" "I need to ask you about something," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Do you remember giving anyone information about MindBridge's technical architecture? Anyone outside our direct working relationship?" The pause was long enough to confirm my suspicions. "Why are you asking?" "Because I'm trying to understand how detailed information about my proprietary algorithms ended up in someone else's investor presentations." Another pause. Then, "Look, Sarah, I thought you knew. Jess told me you two were partners, that she was handling the business development while you focused on the technical side. She said you'd asked her to get up to speed on the technical details, so she could properly represent the project to investors." My stomach dropped. When did these conversations happen? Over the past few months, she'd asked specific questions about the machine learning models, the data processing workflows, The scalability challenges. She said you were too busy with development to handle the business communications yourself, so you delegated the investor relations to her. Marcus, I never delegated anything to anyone. I never told her she could speak for the project, and I certainly never authorized her to access detailed technical documentation. The silence that followed was heavy with realization. Oh shit, Sarah. I think I fucked up. I think I really fucked up. What exactly did you tell her? Everything. System architecture, development timelines, cost projections, market positioning, strategies. She had this whole presentation about MindBridge's competitive advantages and growth potential. It was so professional, so detailed, that I assumed you two had been working on it together. My hands were shaking as I took notes. Did she ever record these conversations? Yeah, she said it was for her own reference to make sure she was representing the technical details accurately to investors. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she was operating without your knowledge. After hanging up with Marcus, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated betrayal I'd ever encountered. This wasn't impulsive opportunism or casual credit stealing. This was a months-long campaign of intellectual property theft, executed with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this before. But instead of feeling defeated by the scope of her deception, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Absolute clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had facts instead of suspicions, evidence instead of intuition, proof instead of paranoia. The woman who'd made me question my own memory and competence had left a digital paper trail that documented every lie she'd told and every boundary she'd crossed. I opened a new document and began constructing a timeline that would make even the most skeptical observer understand what had happened. Date by date, email by email, file access by file. Access, I mapped out her systematic infiltration of my project. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced with multiple sources, each claim supported by digital documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The process took 3 days of obsessive focus, but when I finished, I had something more powerful than anger or accusations. I had an irrefutable case that would speak for itself. The document was 47 pages of pure facts, organized chronologically and supported by screenshots, email headers, file timestamps, and recorded admissions from witnesses she'd manipulated. As I prepared to take the next step, I thought about all the entrepreneurship advice I'd consumed over the years. Fail fast, pivot quickly, learn from rejection. But nobody had prepared me for this scenario. What to do when someone steals your entire startup and convinces your network that you're the unstable one trying to claim credit for collaborative work. The traditional advice would have been to confront her directly, to try to work things out professionally, to protect the business relationships, and avoid burning bridges. But I'd learned something important during those 3 days of investigation. Some bridges deserve to be burned, especially when they're being used to transport stolen goods. My next call was to Sarah Martinez, an intellectual property attorney whose name I'd found through the local entrepreneur meetup network. I need to understand my options, I told her during our consultation. Someone has stolen my business idea, but they've done it in a way that makes me look like the aggressor if I fight back. Tell me everything, she said, and for the next 2 hours, I walked through the entire timeline while she took notes and asked clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and legal complexities of what had happened. Sarah, she said when I finished, this isn't just idea theft. This is fraud, potentially criminal depending on how the file access occurred. You have documentation of unauthorized access to private systems, misrepresentation to third parties, and what appears to be a systematic campaign of intellectual property theft. What can we do about it? We can do a lot, but first I need you to understand something. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. She's built a professional reputation around your work, established relationships with your stolen intellectual property, and positioned herself as the victim of your instability. When we challenge that narrative with facts, she's going to fight, back with everything she has. I'm ready for that. Are you? Because based on what you've told me, she's demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate both people and situations. She's going to try to discredit you personally, professionally, and potentially legally. She'll claim you're bitter about being excluded from a collaborative project, that you're trying to rewrite history to claim credit for shared work, that your accusations are evidence of the mental instability she's already been suggesting to your mutual contacts. I thought about that for a moment, remembering all the times over the past few months when I'd questioned my own memory and competence. The difference is that now I have proof. I have documentation that shows exactly what happened and when. I'm not asking anyone to take my word against hers anymore. That's exactly the right mindset. Evidence speaks louder than emotion, and facts carry more weight than accusations. We're going to let her lies expose themselves. The legal strategy we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than making dramatic accusations or demanding immediate justice, we would systematically document every false claim she'd made and every relationship she'd built on stolen intellectual property. We would contact every investor, advisor, and potential collaborator she'd misled, not to attack her personally, but to clarify the actual ownership and development history of Mindbridge. The goal isn't revenge, Sarah Martinez explained. The goal is correction. We're going to correct the record with facts and let the consequences follow naturally. Our first move was to file formal intellectual property protection for all of Mindbridge's core innovations, establishing legal documentation of my ownership that predated any of her involvement. The patent applications included detailed development histories, complete with timestamps and digital evidence that would make it impossible for anyone to claim shared invention. The second move was more personal, but equally important. I reached out to Dr. Jennifer Liu, the clinical psychologist who'd been consulting on Mindbridge's therapeutic frameworks. Jess had been representing herself as my business partner in communications with Dr. Liu, but I'd never authorized any such partnership. I need to clarify something about my working relationship with Jessica, I told Dr. Liu during our call. She's been representing herself as my business partner, but that's not accurate. She's someone who expressed interest in the marketing aspects of the project, but she has no ownership stake and no authority to speak on behalf of Mindbridge. That's very different from how she presented the situation, Dr. Liu said carefully. She's been discussing significant changes to the therapeutic protocols, talking about pivoting the app's focus based on investor feedback. I assumed these decisions were being made collaboratively. What kind of changes? Shifting away from the personalized AI approach toward a more traditional guided meditation model. She said the original concept was too complex for rapid market deployment, that investors were looking for something more immediately scalable. My heart sank. She wasn't just stealing credit for my work. She was actively undermining the core innovation that made Mindbridge unique. The personalized AI approach was what distinguished my app from the dozens of generic meditation platforms already in the market. Without that differentiating technology, Mindbridge would be just another commodity wellness app with no competitive advantage. Dr. Liu, the personalized AI approach is the entire point of Mindbridge. That's the innovation that makes it potentially revolutionary for mental health support. Anyone can build a meditation app, but nobody else is developing technology that can actually understand and respond to individual users' specific mental health patterns. I understand your position, but Jessica seemed very confident that the pivot was necessary for securing funding. She had data about market preferences and investor priorities that suggested the AI approach was too risky for initial product launch. What data? I'd like to see it. She said it came from your market research and investor feedback sessions. Dr. Liu, I haven't conducted any formal market research or investor feedback sessions. I've been focused entirely on perfecting the technology. Whatever data she showed you, it didn't come from our project. The pause that followed was long enough for me to understand that Dr. Liu was having her own moment of clarity. Sarah, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about what's been happening here. That conversation, which lasted over an hour, revealed the full scope of how Jess had been misrepresenting not just her role in the project, but the project's entire direction and development strategy. She'd been telling collaborators and advisors that I was the technical implementer of her business vision, rather than the creator and owner of the underlying innovation. Even more disturbing, she'd been gradually changing the fundamental nature of what MindBridge was supposed to be, steering it away from the breakthrough technology I'd developed toward a generic product that would be easier to rush to market. She wasn't just stealing my work, she was actively destroying what made it valuable. By the end of that week, I had contacted every person Jess had misled about her role in MindBridge. The responses revealed a pattern of systematic misrepresentation that went far beyond casual credit stealing. She'd been operating as if she owned my intellectual property, making strategic decisions about the project's direction, and building business relationships based on completely fabricated authority. But the most revealing conversation was with Tom Rodriguez, a venture capitalist who'd apparently been in advanced discussions with Jess about funding MindBridge's development. According to Tom, she'd presented herself as the founder and CEO, with me listed as a technical contractor she'd hired to implement her vision. "Wait," I interrupted during our call. "She told you I was a contractor?" "Yes, she said you were, a talented developer she'd brought on to build the app, but that the core concept and business strategy were her innovations. She had very detailed documentation about the market opportunity, competitive analysis, user acquisition strategies. It was one of the most comprehensive early-stage presentations I'd seen." "Tom, I need to tell you something important. Every piece of that presentation was based on my work, my research, and my intellectual property. Jessica has no ownership stake in MindBridge and no authority to represent the project to investors." "That's a very serious accusation, Sarah." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact, and I have extensive documentation to prove it." When I sent Tom the evidence package I'd compiled, the timeline, the file access records, the email correspondences, the development history, his response came within hours. "Sarah, this is deeply concerning. Based on what you've shared, it appears Jessica has been misrepresenting fundamental facts about this project. We need to meet in person immediately." That meeting became the template for every subsequent conversation I had with people Jess had misled. Present the facts, provide the documentation, let the evidence speak for itself. No emotional appeals, no personal attacks, just systematic correction of the record with irrefutable proof. The response was uniform: shock, apology, and immediate distancing from any association with her fraudulent representations. Within 2 weeks, every professional relationship she'd built on my stolen intellectual property had evaporated. The network she'd constructed around my work collapsed like a house of cards when the foundation of lies was exposed. But I knew this was just the beginning. Someone who'd executed such a sophisticated theft wouldn't surrender quietly when exposed. She'd escalate, probably dramatically, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The difference was that now I wasn't preparing alone, and I wasn't preparing defensively. I had allies who understood the truth, evidence that couldn't be disputed, and legal protection that established my ownership beyond any reasonable doubt. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between being reactive and being strategic. The scared, confused woman who'd signed away half her intellectual property in a coffee shop was gone. In her place was someone who understood that documentation defeats manipulation, that facts outweigh feelings, and that sometimes the best way to handle betrayal is to let the betrayer's own actions expose their character. As I prepared for whatever, Escalation was coming next. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, confidence in my own version of reality. The gaslighting was over, the evidence was compiled, and the real fight was about to begin. The strategic response phase of my journey began with a decision that would have seemed impossible to the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. I was going to fight back, but I was going to do it my way. Not with emotional outbursts or public accusations, but with the same methodical precision that had built MindBridge in the first place. If Jess wanted to play games with stolen intellectual property, she was about to discover that the person who created the technology understood systems better than she realized. My first move was counterintuitive. Instead of immediately exposing her fraud, I began building. While she was busy managing the relationships she'd constructed on lies, I started developing MindBridge 2.0, incorporating innovations that made the original concept look like a rough draft. Every sleepless night she'd forced me to endure, every moment of self-doubt she'd manufactured, every breakthrough she'd tried to steal. All of it became fuel for creating something so advanced that her theft would become irrelevant. The new version wasn't just technically superior, it was philosophically different. Where she'd tried to dumb down the AI to appeal to generic market demands, I pushed deeper into personalization technology that could detect emotional patterns in real time, predict mental health crises before they occurred, and provide interventions so precisely calibrated that traditional therapy apps would look like digital fortune cookies in comparison. Working 18-hour days in a shared workspace I'd rented across town, I implemented machine learning algorithms that made my original code look elementary. The new MindBridge could analyze voice patterns to detect depression, monitor typing, rhythms to identify anxiety spikes, and even use camera data to recognize facial micro-expressions that indicated emotional distress. This wasn't just an app anymore. It was a comprehensive mental health ecosystem that could genuinely save lives. But innovation alone wasn't enough. While I was building the future, I was also systematically documenting the present. Every false claim Jess made, every misrepresentation she posted on social media, every interview she gave about her revolutionary approach to mental health technology, I recorded all of it. Not to compile evidence for dramatic confrontations, but to create an irrefutable timeline of fraud that would speak for itself when the time came. The breakthrough moment arrived when she made her biggest mistake, agreeing to keynote the Pacific Northwest Tech Innovation Summit. The event was being live-streamed to thousands of entrepreneurs and investors, and she'd been invited to present the future of AI-driven mental health solutions. Her presentation was scheduled to include live demonstrations of MindBridge's breakthrough capabilities she couldn't actually demonstrate because she didn't understand the underlying technology. I registered for the summit under my company name and booked a vendor booth directly across from the main stage. While she prepared to present my work as her own innovation, I prepared to demonstrate what actual innovation looked like. The new MindBridge was so advanced that any technical expert in the audience would immediately recognize the difference between authentic breakthrough technology and stolen prototypes. But I wasn't planning to sabotage her presentation or create dramatic confrontations. Instead, I was going to let her hang herself with her own limitations while simultaneously showing the world what genuine innovation looked like. The contrast would be so stark that no explanation would be necessary. 3 days before the summit, my legal strategy accelerated. Sarah Martinez had prepared a comprehensive intellectual property filing that established my ownership of not just the original MindBridge concept, but every innovation that had emerged from it. The filing included development timelines, code repositories, design evolution documentation, and witness statements from every legitimate collaborator who'd worked on the project. More importantly, we'd prepared cease and desist notices for every organization that was using my stolen intellectual property. The timing was strategic. They would be delivered simultaneously to all relevant parties exactly 1 hour before Jess took the stage to present her innovation to the tech community. The goal isn't to create chaos, Sarah Martinez explained during our final preparation meeting. The goal is to create clarity. When she's standing on that stage trying to explain technology she doesn't understand, and when the cease and desist notices are being delivered to her claimed partners and investors, the truth will become undeniable. What if she tries to blame me for sabotaging her presentation? Let her try. We have 18 months of documented evidence showing that every piece of technology she's claiming to have developed was created by you, often months or years before she was even involved in the project. The timestamps don't lie, and the technical complexity of your work speaks for itself. The week leading up to the summit, something unexpected happened. My confidence transformed into something deeper and more sustainable. For months, I'd been operating from a defensive position, trying to prove my own competence and ownership against someone else's false narrative. But as I prepared to demonstrate MindBridge 2.0's capabilities, I realized I'd moved beyond defending myself. I was now advancing the entire field of mental health technology. The original betrayal had forced me to become better than I'd ever planned to be. The need to prove ownership of my intellectual property had driven me to document and understand my own creative process more thoroughly than any entrepreneur I knew. The challenge of rebuilding from stolen foundations had pushed me to innovations I might never have attempted if my original path hadn't been disrupted. Jess had intended to steal my future, but she'd accidentally forced me to build a better one. The woman taking the stage at the tech summit wouldn't just be reclaiming her stolen work. She'd be demonstrating why some things can't actually be stolen, only copied, and why copies are always inferior to originals when the original creator understands how to evolve. The morning of the summit, I arrived early to set up my vendor booth with equipment that most attendees had never seen before. The new MindBridge ran on custom hardware I'd designed specifically for real-time emotional analysis, connected to AI models that processed psychological data faster than users could experience the emotions themselves. The demonstration setup looked like something from a mental health research laboratory, because that's essentially what it was. Conference attendees began gathering around my booth hours before the presentations started, drawn by technology that was obviously operating on a different level than typical startup demos. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a prominent researcher in computational psychology, spent 30 minutes testing the system's ability to detect stress patterns in real-time conversation analysis. "This is extraordinary work," she told me after experiencing the system's capabilities firsthand. "I've never seen emotion recognition technology this sophisticated outside of academic research labs. How long have you been developing this approach?" "About 2 years of intensive development, with the core breakthrough happening 18 months ago," I replied, making sure to establish the timeline for anyone within earshot. "Have you published any papers on this methodology?" "I'd love to. Cite your work in my upcoming research on AI applications in therapeutic interventions." "I haven't published academically yet, but I have extensive development documentation that traces the evolution of these algorithms from initial concept to current implementation. I'd be happy to share the technical specifications with you." Word spread quickly through the summit that something genuinely innovative was happening at Booth 47. By mid-morning, I had a constant crowd of developers, researchers, and investors, experiencing technology that redefined what they thought was possible in mental health applications. The questions they asked revealed sophisticated understanding of the field, and their excitement was the kind that only emerges when people encounter authentic breakthrough innovation. Meanwhile, across the venue, Jess was preparing for her keynote presentation with what I could only imagine was growing panic. She'd built her reputation on stolen technology she didn't understand, and she was about to face an audience that included some of the most technically sophisticated minds in the industry. Any serious question about implementation details or algorithm architecture would expose her complete lack of understanding. At 2 p.m., exactly 1 hour before her scheduled presentation, the cease and desist notices were delivered. I watched from my booth as conference organizers approached several attendees who'd been listed as Jess's business partners or advisory board members. The conversations were brief, but clearly serious, with multiple people immediately checking their phones and stepping away to make calls. Tom Rodriguez, the venture capitalist who'd been in funding discussions with her, approached my booth shortly after receiving his notice. "Sarah, I need to understand what's happening here. I just received legal documentation claiming that Jessica has been misrepresenting her ownership of intellectual property I've been evaluating for investment." "Tom, everything you need to understand is right here," I replied, gesturing to the MindBridge 2.0 demonstration. "This is what actual innovation in mental health AI looks like. What Jessica has been showing you is stolen prototypes of my original work from over a year ago." He spent the next 20 minutes testing the system, asking detailed technical questions that I answered with the fluency of someone who'd created every component from scratch. The contrast with his previous interactions with Jess became obvious immediately. He was finally talking to someone who understood the technology at a fundamental level rather than someone who'd memorized talking points about stolen concepts. "The difference is remarkable," he said after experiencing the full demonstration. "The sophistication level, the integration of components, the obvious deep understanding of both the technical and therapeutic applications, this is clearly the work of the actual innovator, rather than someone presenting borrowed concepts. That's because this represents 2 years of continuous development by someone who lives and breathes this technology, rather than 6 months of trying to understand stolen documentation." By 3 p.m., 15 minutes before Jess's keynote, the Tech Summit had transformed into an unofficial showcase for MindBridge 2.0. Conference organizers had approached me about moving my demonstration to a larger venue within the conference space, and several attendees were live tweeting about the revolutionary mental health AI they'd discovered in the vendor area. The irony was perfect. While she prepared to present stolen innovation to gain credibility, authentic innovation was organically drawing the audience away from the main stage. The contrast would have been obvious even without the legal documentation. Real breakthroughs attract genuine excitement, while borrowed concepts generate polite interest at best. When 3:15 arrived and Jess took the stage, I was surrounded by researchers, developers, and investors who were more interested in understanding how MindBridge 2.0's emotion prediction algorithms worked than in watching a keynote presentation. But I made sure we could hear the audio from her talk, because I wanted to witness the moment when stolen innovation met technical scrutiny. Her presentation started confidently enough, with polished slides about market opportunities and user engagement statistics. But when she reached the technical demonstration portion, everything began to unravel. The MindBridge prototype she tried to demonstrate was clearly the version I'd built 18 months earlier. Functional but primitive compared to what the audience had just experienced at my booth. "As you can see," she said, attempting to show the app's mood tracking capabilities. "Our AI can identify basic emotional patterns and provide appropriate meditation recommendations." Dr. Rodriguez, who was standing near my booth but listening to the presentation, shook her head slightly. "That's essentially just keyword matching with predetermined responses. Nothing like the predictive emotional modeling we just saw demonstrated. Over here!" The questions from the audience started immediately. "Can you explain the machine learning architecture that enables real-time emotion prediction? How does your algorithm distinguish between clinical depression and situational sadness? What's your approach to training data validation for mental health applications?" Each question exposed another gap in her understanding. Her responses became increasingly vague, relying on buzzwords and generic explanations that revealed she had no comprehension of the technology she was claiming to have developed. The audience's energy shifted from engagement to skepticism to something approaching embarrassment for her obvious lack of knowledge. The breaking point came when Dr. Sarah Kim, a machine learning researcher from Stanford, asked a direct question about the neural network architecture underlying the emotion recognition system. "I'm particularly interested in your approach to handling the temporal dependencies in emotional state transitions. Can you walk us through your model design? Jess's response was a masterclass in obvious deflection. That's getting quite technical, but our development team has implemented industry best practices for neural network optimization. Dr. Kim pressed further. I understand, but as the innovator of this approach, surely you can explain the fundamental architecture decisions that make your system unique. The silence that followed was devastating. Here was someone claiming to have revolutionized mental health AI who couldn't answer basic questions about the technology she supposedly invented. The contrast with my detailed technical discussions just minutes earlier made her lack of understanding undeniable. But the final nail in the coffin of her credibility came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rivera, my former freelance developer, who had apparently attended the summit and witnessed both my booth demonstration and her keynote presentation. During the Q&A period, he stood up and said something that changed everything. I have a question about the development timeline, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the auditorium. I worked on the early technical implementation of this system, and I'm curious about how you've evolved the original architecture that Sarah Chen developed in her apartment over the past 2 years. The audience's attention sharpened immediately. Marcus continued, because what I'm seeing in your demonstration looks identical to the prototype Sarah showed me 18 months ago, while what she's demonstrating today in the vendor area represents dramatic advancement of those original concepts. Jess's response was barely audible. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I'm referring to the fact that I have email correspondence with you where you specifically asked me to explain Sarah's proprietary algorithms so you could better understand the technology you were trying to present to investors, Marcus replied. Would you like me to share those emails with the audience? The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. What had begun as a keynote presentation about innovative mental health technology had become a public exposure of intellectual property theft. The audience wasn't just skeptical, they were witnessing a fraud being documented in real time. Conference. Organizers approached the stage, and after a brief conversation with Jess, announced that the presentation would be cut short due to technical difficulties. But everyone in the room understood that the real difficulty was the complete collapse of her credibility. As attendees filed out of the auditorium, many of them came directly to my booth to understand what they'd just witnessed. The story spread quickly through the conference. Someone had been caught presenting stolen technology while the actual innovator was demonstrating the real breakthrough just across the venue. I've never seen anything like that, Tom Rodriguez told me as the formal presentations concluded. The contrast was so stark that no explanation was necessary. Anyone with technical knowledge could see immediately who understood the technology and who was trying to fake their way through borrowed concepts. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Dr. Rodriguez approached me with a proposal that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Sarah, I'm organizing a consortium of research institutions that are developing ethical AI applications for mental health. Based on what I've seen today, I'd like to invite you to lead our technical advisory board and potentially collaborate on bringing this technology to clinical trial. The woman who'd been made to feel like an unstable failure was being invited to lead cutting-edge research in her field. The technology that someone had tried to steal was being recognized as genuinely revolutionary by the people most qualified to make that judgment. The future that had been stolen was being replaced by something even better. As I packed up my demonstration equipment that evening, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 6 months ago, I'd been an isolated developer questioning my own competence and fighting to maintain ownership of my work. Tonight, I was leaving a major tech conference with research partnerships, investment offers, and industry recognition that established me as a leader in my field. Jess had tried to steal my professional future, but she'd accidentally forced me to build a better one. Her attempt to present stolen innovation had created the perfect platform for demonstrating authentic breakthrough technology. Her lies had been exposed not through accusations or legal documents, but through the simple contrast between borrowed concepts and genuine innovation. The most important lesson wasn't about intellectual property protection or business strategy. It was about the difference between reaction and response. For months, I'd been reacting to her theft, trying to defend myself against false narratives and protect work that had already been compromised. But when I shifted to responding by building something better, the original theft became irrelevant. Innovation can't actually be stolen, only copied. And copies are always inferior to originals when the original creator understands how to evolve. The future belongs to people who create rather than people who steal, and sometimes betrayal forces you to discover capabilities you never knew you had. As I drove home that night, I realized the woman who'd signed away half her intellectual property in a coffee shop was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that the best response to theft is innovation, the best answer to lies is demonstration, and the best revenge is success that makes the original betrayal look like a favor in disguise. The strategic response phase was complete, but I had a feeling that the real victory was just beginning. The resolution phase began not with courtroom drama or public confrontations, but with something far more powerful: the quiet momentum of unstoppable truth. Within 48 hours of the tech summit, my inbox had transformed from a collection of rejection letters and automated responses into a stream of opportunities that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Research institutions, venture capital firms, and healthcare organizations were reaching out not to evaluate my work, but to understand how quickly they could integrate MindBridge's revolutionary capabilities into their existing programs. Dr. Angela Rodriguez's consortium invitation materialized into something extraordinary within the first week. The National Institute of Mental Health had been searching for breakthrough AI applications that could revolutionize therapeutic interventions, and MindBridge, too. Zero's predictive emotional modeling represented exactly the kind of innovation they'd been hoping to discover. What started as a simple collaboration discussion evolved into a multi-million-dollar research partnership that would position my technology at the forefront of computational psychology for the next decade. Sarah, what you've developed isn't just innovative, it's paradigm-shifting, Dr. Rodriguez explained during our second meeting at her Stanford laboratory. We've been working on emotion recognition systems for years, but your approach to predictive modeling represents a fundamental breakthrough in how AI can support mental health interventions. This technology could prevent suicide attempts, identify depression before it becomes clinical, and provide personalized therapeutic support at a scale we've never imagined possible. The research partnership came with resources that transformed MindBridge from a solo project into a comprehensive platform with clinical validation, ethical oversight, and implementation pathways that would ensure the technology actually reached the people who needed it most. Instead of fighting to protect stolen intellectual property, I was now collaborating with the world's leading experts to advance an entire field of study. But the most profound transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. The woman who'd spent months questioning her own competence and fighting to maintain ownership of her work had evolved into someone who understood that authentic innovation creates its own protection. When you're genuinely advancing human knowledge and capability, theft becomes irrelevant because copies can't compete with continuous evolution. Meanwhile, Jess's carefully constructed professional identity was collapsing with the kind of systematic thoroughness that only comes when lies meet sustained scrutiny. The Tech Summit exposure had created a ripple effect throughout the startup community, with every claim she'd ever made about her expertise and innovation now being examined with skeptical attention. The venture capital firms that had been courting her withdrew their interest. The advisory positions she'd claimed were quietly rescinded, and the speaking engagements that had built her reputation were canceled as event organizers distanced themselves from someone who'd been publicly exposed as fraudulent. But the most devastating consequence wasn't professional rejection. It was the complete loss of credibility that made any future claims about innovation immediately suspect. In the tight-knit world of tech entrepreneurship, reputation is everything. And once someone is known for stealing intellectual property, every subsequent project they propose is viewed through the lens of potential fraud. She'd destroyed not just her current opportunities, but her ability to build legitimate future ones. The legal resolution came with surprising swiftness once the evidence became public. Sarah Martinez had prepared for months of complex litigation, but Jess's legal team advised immediate settlement once they reviewed the documentation we'd compiled. The intellectual property theft was so thoroughly documented, and her public exposure so complete, that fighting the case would have only prolonged her professional destruction while accomplishing nothing constructive. Her attorneys contacted us within a week of the summit, Sarah Martinez explained during our settlement meeting. They're not interested in defending the indefensible. The evidence is overwhelming, the professional consequences are already severe, and continuing to fight would only make the situation worse for their client. The settlement terms were comprehensive. Complete relinquishment of any claims to MindBridge intellectual property, public acknowledgement of my sole ownership of all related innovations, cessation of any business activities based on stolen technology, and financial compensation for the damages caused by her misrepresentation to potential partners and investors. But more importantly, the settlement included language that would prevent her from ever again claiming involvement in mental health AI development or using my work as the foundation for future projects. The financial compensation is significant, Sarah Martinez noted, but the real value is in the complete legal protection this provides for your continued innovation. You'll never have to worry about her attempting to claim ownership of your work again, and any future investors or partners will have clear documentation of your sole ownership of this entire technology platform. But perhaps the most satisfying element of the resolution was how completely unnecessary the legal process had become. By the time we reached settlement, Jess's professional reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that she posed no real threat to my continued success. The stolen intellectual property she'd tried to build a career around had been revealed as inferior copies of work that was continuing to evolve far beyond her understanding. The contrast became even more stark when MindBridge 2.0 began its clinical trial phase. Working with Dr. Rodriguez's consortium, we implemented the system in 5 major medical centers to test its effectiveness in real-world therapeutic settings. The results exceeded even our most optimistic projections. The AI's predictive capabilities were identifying mental health crises an average of 72 hours before traditional assessment methods, allowing for preventive interventions that were dramatically reducing hospitalization rates and improving patient outcomes. These results are unprecedented, Dr. Kim from Stanford reported during our first quarterly review. We're seeing a 40% reduction in emergency mental health interventions among patients using the MindBridge system, which suggests that predictive emotional modeling is fundamentally changing how we approach psychological care. This isn't just technological innovation, it's a revolution in therapeutic methodology. The clinical success attracted attention from healthcare organizations worldwide. Within 6 months of the settlement, MindBridge had licensing agreements with hospital systems across 3 continents, research partnerships with universities in 12 countries, and implementation pilots in governmental health programs that served over 50 million people. The technology that someone had tried to steal was now improving mental health outcomes on a global scale. But the personal transformation was even more profound than the professional success. The experience of having my work stolen and my competence questioned had forced me to develop capabilities I never knew I possessed. The need to document my innovation process had made me more systematic and thorough in my development methodology. The requirement to defend my technical decisions had deepened my understanding of the underlying principles that made my approach unique. The challenge of rebuilding from stolen foundations had pushed me to create something far more advanced than my original vision. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between defending existing achievements and continuously advancing beyond them. For months, I'd been focused on protecting what I'd already created, fighting to maintain ownership of intellectual property that represented past innovation. But when I shifted my energy toward building the future rather than defending the past, the original theft became irrelevant because I was always working several generations ahead of whatever could be copied. The woman who'd signed away half her intellectual property in a coffee shop had been operating from scarcity thinking, afraid that her ideas weren't good enough, grateful for any validation, willing to compromise ownership for the illusion of partnership. The woman leading clinical trials for revolutionary mental health technology operated from abundance thinking, confident in her ability to continue innovating, selective about collaborations, unwilling to compromise vision for convenience. 6 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected message from Marcus Rivera, the developer who'd inadvertently helped expose Jess's fraud at the tech summit. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened, and I wanted to thank you for handling everything the way you did. You could have destroyed her publicly, made the legal process as painful as possible, used the situation for personal revenge. Instead, you focused on building something better and let the truth speak for itself. That approach not only resolved the immediate problem, it created something valuable for everyone who needs better mental health support." His message crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, but transcendence. When someone tries to steal your future, the best response is to build a better one. When someone questions your competence, the most effective answer is demonstrated excellence. When someone tries to rewrite your story, the ultimate victory is continuing to write new chapters that make the original conflict irrelevant. A year after receiving that ceramic mug in the mail, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the same Pacific Northwest Tech Innovation Summit, where Jess's credibility had collapsed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to present in the exact venue where stolen innovation had been exposed and authentic breakthrough had been recognized. But my presentation wasn't about intellectual property theft or professional betrayal. Instead, I spoke about the evolution of mental health technology and the potential for AI to provide personalized therapeutic support that could prevent psychological crises before they occurred. I demonstrated MindBridge 3.0's capabilities, which included innovations that made the previous versions look like early prototypes, and discussed the clinical trial results that were already changing how healthcare providers approached mental health interventions. Innovation isn't just about creating something new, I told the audience during my presentation. It's about continuously advancing human capability and understanding. The most important characteristic of genuine innovation isn't uniqueness, it's evolution. The ability to build on previous breakthroughs and push beyond existing limitations. In the audience, I noticed several faces I recognized from the previous year's conference, including Dr. Rodriguez, Tom Rodriguez, and even Marcus Rivera. But there were also hundreds of new attendees who knew nothing about the intellectual property drama that had unfolded in this same venue 12 months earlier. For them, I was simply the innovator behind breakthrough mental health technology that was improving lives worldwide. After my presentation, during the networking reception, Dr. Rodriguez approached me with an observation that captured the complete transformation of the situation. "Sarah, I've been thinking about the contrast between this year's keynote and last year's controversy. What's remarkable isn't just that you've succeeded despite the theft. It's that the theft ultimately became irrelevant because you continued innovating beyond what could be stolen. The person who tried to build a career on your work is completely forgotten while you're leading an entire field of study." "That's the thing about authentic innovation," I replied. "It can't actually be stolen, only copied. And copies are always static while originals continue evolving. The best protection against intellectual property theft isn't legal documentation. It's continued advancement that makes the stolen work obsolete." But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the evening came during a conversation with Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd asked the technical questions that had exposed Jess's lack of understanding the previous year. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you something," she said. "Your response to that situation inspired me to be more protective of my own research and more strategic about collaboration. Watching you transform betrayal into breakthrough innovation changed how I think about resilience and professional development. The realization that my experience had influenced other women in technology to be more strategic about protecting their work added another dimension to the resolution. The story wasn't just about one person overcoming intellectual property theft, it was about demonstrating that authentic innovation, strategic thinking, and continued advancement could transform any betrayal into an opportunity for transcendence. As I drove home from the conference that night, I reflected on the complete transformation of my relationship with the original betrayal. For months, it had felt like a wound that dominated my thoughts and constrained my possibilities. Now, it felt like a catalyst that had forced me to develop capabilities I might never have discovered through conventional success. The woman who'd been made to question her own competence had become a recognized leader in her field. The technology that someone had tried to steal was now improving mental health outcomes for millions of people. The future that had been threatened by betrayal had evolved into something far more significant than the original vision. Most importantly, I'd learned that the ultimate response to someone trying to steal your dreams isn't to fight for the dreams they tried to take. It's to build dreams so advanced that their theft becomes impossible. When you're continuously innovating at the cutting edge of human capability, copies can't keep up with originals, and thieves become irrelevant because they're always working with obsolete information. The ceramic mug still sat on my kitchen counter, but it no longer represented betrayal or lost trust. Instead, it had become a reminder of how completely a situation could transform when you responded to challenges with innovation rather than reaction. It was a monument to the power of building forward instead of fighting backward, and evidence that sometimes the best thing someone can do for your future is to force you to create a better one than you originally imagined. The woman holding that mug now wasn't the same person who'd received it in a brown paper package 18 months earlier. She was someone who understood that authentic innovation creates its own protection, that continuous advancement makes theft irrelevant, and that the most powerful victory over betrayal is building something so valuable that the original conflict becomes a footnote in a much larger story of positive impact. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by patent certificates, research partnership agreements, and clinical trial results that documented technology improving lives worldwide, I realized that Jess had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible: the necessity to discover what I was truly capable of creating when everything I'd built before was threatened. The theft had been devastating, but the transcendence had been revolutionary. Have you ever had someone try to steal your dreams, only to discover that the experience forced you to build something even better? Sometimes the people who try to limit your future accidentally become the catalyst for exceeding every limitation you thought existed. Drop your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to understand that betrayal can become the foundation for breakthrough, and that authentic innovation always finds a way to evolve beyond whatever tries to contain it. The legacy phase of my journey began 2 years after that ceramic mug arrived at my doorstep, but it started with an email that would have terrified the woman I used to be. The message came from Elena Vasquez, a 23-year-old computer science graduate from MIT, and her words carried the weight of familiar desperation. "Sarah, I've been following your work since the Tech Summit exposure, and I need advice. My business partner has been claiming credit for code I wrote, and I think she's trying to push me out of my own startup. Everyone believes her version of events, and I'm starting to question my own memory. How did you find the strength to fight? Back when everyone thought you were wrong?" Reading Elena's email, I felt the ghost of my former self, that confused, gaslit version of me who'd spent months wondering if her own recollections could be trusted. But instead of the helpless anger I'd once carried, I felt something entirely different, the responsibility that comes with having survived something that others are still enduring. This wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about the pattern of intellectual theft that continued to plague innovators, particularly women in technology, and the systematic way that victims were made to doubt their own experiences. I called Elena immediately, not just to offer advice, but to understand how widespread this problem had become. During our 2-hour conversation, she described manipulation tactics that were eerily familiar: the gradual insertion into project ownership, the psychological undermining of confidence, the network building around stolen intellectual property. But she also mentioned something that hadn't existed during my ordeal: a growing community of entrepreneurs who'd experienced similar betrayals and were beginning to connect with each other. There's this underground network of founders who've been through intellectual property theft, Elena explained. Women mostly, but some men too. They share strategies for documentation, legal resources, psychological support. Your story has become legendary in these circles, not just because you won, but because you transformed the experience into something that advanced your entire field. That conversation sparked an idea that would define the next phase of my journey. What if the painful experience I'd endured could become the foundation for protecting other innovators from similar betrayals? What if the documentation strategies I'd developed, the legal frameworks that had proven effective, and the psychological resilience techniques I'd learned could be systematized and shared with vulnerable entrepreneurs before they became victims? Within 6 months, I'd launched the Authentic Innovation Protection Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to help early-stage entrepreneurs safeguard their intellectual property while building sustainable businesses. The program combined legal education, documentation best practices, psychological resilience training, and community support in ways that addressed both the technical and emotional aspects of protecting creative work. But this wasn't just about defensive strategies. The core philosophy of the initiative was that the best protection against intellectual property theft is continuous innovation that makes stealing irrelevant. We taught entrepreneurs not just how to document their work, but how to build development processes that stayed ahead of potential thieves, how to create collaborative relationships that enhanced rather than threatened their ownership, and how to recognize manipulation tactics before they could take root. The response was overwhelming. Within the first year, over 1,500 entrepreneurs had completed the program, with follow-up surveys showing a 94% success rate in maintaining ownership of their intellectual property and building sustainable businesses around their innovations. More importantly, participants reported increased confidence in their own competence, better ability to recognize trustworthy collaborators, and stronger psychological resilience when facing professional challenges. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd become not just a research partner but a close friend, observed something during one of our quarterly reviews that crystallized the broader impact. "Sarah, what you've created here goes beyond intellectual property protection. You're building psychological infrastructure that helps people trust their own judgment and maintain their sense of competence, even when others try to undermine them. That's not just business education. That's empowerment at a fundamental level." The success of the initiative attracted attention from unexpected sources. Harvard Business School invited me to develop a case study about transforming personal betrayal into systematic solutions for widespread problems. The Department of Commerce asked me to consult on federal programs designed to support innovation in emerging technologies. Most surprisingly, the World Intellectual Property Organization requested my input on international frameworks for protecting individual inventors from corporate and collaborative theft. Each of these opportunities reinforced a lesson that had taken me years to fully understand. Authentic innovation creates expanding circles of positive impact that extend far beyond the original creator's intentions. The technology I'd developed to improve mental health outcomes was now helping entrepreneurs protect their creative work, which was enabling more breakthrough innovations that would improve lives in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source, Jess herself. 3 years after our legal settlement, she sent a message through my attorney that was simultaneously surprising and inevitable. I want to acknowledge that I destroyed something valuable through my actions, and I want to understand if there's any way to make amends that would be meaningful rather than just self-serving. The request forced me to confront a question I'd been avoiding. What did justice actually look like when someone had systematically stolen your work and tried to destroy your professional credibility? The legal settlement had restored my intellectual property rights and provided financial compensation, but it hadn't addressed the deeper violation of trust and the psychological damage caused by months of gaslighting and manipulation. After consulting with my therapist, my attorney, and several trusted advisors, I agreed to a mediated conversation with specific conditions. The discussion would be recorded, a neutral facilitator would be present, and the focus would be on understanding the impact of her actions rather than negotiating any kind of ongoing relationship. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd expected. Jess didn't make excuses or try to minimize what she'd done. Instead, she walked through her decision-making process with brutal honesty that revealed the calculated nature of her theft while also exposing the psychological factors that had driven her to such destructive behavior. I convinced myself that I was improving your work, that I was adding value you couldn't create alone, she explained during our session. But the truth is that I was threatened by your competence and terrified of my own inadequacy. Stealing. Your innovation felt easier than developing my own capabilities, and once I started down that path, each lie required bigger lies to maintain the illusion. What's hardest to accept, she continued, is that I destroyed something genuinely valuable. Not just your work, but the collaborative relationship we could have built if I'd been honest about my limitations and asked for mentorship instead of attempting theft. The conversation was emotionally exhausting, but psychologically liberating. For the first time since the betrayal began, I had complete clarity about her motivations and methods. There was no remaining mystery about why it had happened or how I could have prevented it. The closure wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding that her actions had reflected her character rather than my inadequacy. More importantly, the conversation reinforced my commitment to the Authentic Innovation Protection Initiative. Jess's honest account of her theft process became a case study that we used to help other entrepreneurs recognize manipulation tactics before they could take hold. Her description of the psychological factors that drove her to destructive behavior became part of our training on how to identify collaborators who might pose risks to intellectual property. But the most unexpected outcome of that conversation was Jess's request to contribute to the initiative in a way that would provide restitution while supporting other entrepreneurs. She proposed creating a comprehensive case study of intellectual property theft from the perpetrator's perspective, documenting the methods, motivations, and psychological patterns that drive people to steal others' work. I can't undo what I did to you, she said during our final mediated conversation. But I can potentially prevent others from making the same destructive choices by exposing how the theft process actually works from the inside. After extensive consultation with legal and ethical advisors, I agreed to let her contribute to the initiative under strict conditions. Her participation would be clearly identified as restitution for her previous actions. All content would be fact-checked and verified by independent sources, and any compensation would go directly to supporting entrepreneurs who'd experienced intellectual property theft. The resulting case study became one of the most valuable resources in our program. Having a detailed account of theft methodology from someone who'd actually executed such a campaign provided insights that no victim's perspective could offer. Entrepreneurs who completed the program reported that understanding the perpetrator's mindset made them more effective at recognizing and preventing manipulation attempts. 5 years after receiving that ceramic mug, I was invited to deliver the commencement address at MIT's School of Engineering. Standing before hundreds of graduating innovators, I reflected on how completely my understanding of success and failure had transformed through the experience of betrayal and recovery. The most important lesson I can share with you today, I told the graduates, isn't about building better technology or creating more efficient algorithms. It's about understanding that your greatest innovations will often emerge from your most difficult challenges, and that the people who try to limit your potential will accidentally force you to discover capabilities you never knew you possessed. I described how intellectual property theft had forced me to develop documentation skills, legal knowledge, psychological resilience, and strategic thinking that had made me more effective as an innovator and entrepreneur. How the need to rebuild from stolen foundations had pushed me to create technology that was generations ahead of what could be copied. How the experience of being gaslit and manipulated had taught me to trust my own judgment and recognize authentic collaboration. The person who tried to steal my future accidentally gave me the skills to build a better one than I'd originally imagined, I explained. But more importantly, that experience taught me that innovation isn't just about creating new technology. It's about using breakthrough thinking to solve problems that extend far beyond your original vision. The speech was recorded and shared widely in entrepreneurship communities, eventually becoming required viewing in several business schools. But the most meaningful response came from Elena Vasquez, the young entrepreneur who'd reached out for advice years earlier. She'd not only successfully protected her own intellectual property, but had built a thriving company that was revolutionizing sustainable energy storage. "Your story didn't just help me solve my immediate problem," she wrote. After the commencement speech went viral, it taught me that challenges can become competitive advantages if you respond to them strategically. The skills I developed protecting my work made me a better entrepreneur than I would have been without the threat. Today, MindBridge serves over 10 million users across 6 continents, with clinical outcomes that continue to exceed expectations for AI-powered mental health interventions. The Authentic Innovation Protection Initiative has helped thousands of entrepreneurs safeguard their intellectual property while building sustainable businesses. The research partnerships that emerged from my work have advanced the entire field of computational psychology. But perhaps the most significant legacy is the shift in how the entrepreneurship community thinks about intellectual property protection and collaborative relationships. The conversation has moved beyond simple legal safeguards to encompass psychological preparation, strategic documentation, and community support systems that help innovators thrive rather than just survive. The ceramic mug still sits on my kitchen counter, but its meaning has evolved completely. It's no longer a symbol of betrayal or lost trust. It's a reminder of how profoundly a situation can transform when you respond to theft with innovation, to manipulation with strategic thinking, and to attempts at destruction with commitment to building something better. Sometimes I think about the alternate timeline where Jess had approached me honestly about wanting to learn business development skills, where we could have built a genuine partnership based on complementary capabilities rather than stolen intellectual property. That relationship might have been successful, but it wouldn't have pushed either of us to develop the individual excellence that ultimately emerged from the conflict. The woman holding that mug today understands something that her younger self couldn't have imagined, that the most valuable innovations often emerge from the most painful challenges. That authentic success requires protecting your vision while remaining open to legitimate collaboration. And that the best response to someone trying to steal your future is to build one so advanced that theft becomes impossible. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by patents, research awards, and letters from entrepreneurs whose careers were protected by the initiative, I realized that Jess's betrayal had become the foundation for impact that extended far beyond my original vision. The technology that someone tried to steal was now improving mental health outcomes worldwide. The experience of having my competence questioned had led to programs that strengthened thousands of other innovators. The systematic theft that nearly destroyed my confidence had become the catalyst for systematic solutions that protected entire communities. This is what transcendence looks like, not just overcoming betrayal, but transforming it into a force for positive change that reaches far beyond your own recovery. Not just reclaiming what was stolen, but building something so valuable that the original theft becomes the first step in a much larger story of innovation and impact. The future belongs to people who understand that authentic innovation can't be stolen, only copied, and that copies are always inferior to originals when the original creator continues evolving. But more than that, it belongs to people who recognize that their greatest challenges can become their most powerful tools for creating positive change in the world. Have you ever discovered that your worst professional betrayal became the catalyst for your greatest breakthrough? Sometimes the people who try to destroy our dreams accidentally force us to build ones that are bigger, better, and more impactful than anything we originally imagined. Drop your transformation story below. Someone out there needs to understand that innovation thrives under pressure, and that authentic success is always stronger than whatever tries to steal it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.